Welcome back to the Scotti-BYTE channel, and this is Scott. Today we want to discuss managing Incus from Windows. So Incus servers are normally managed from the Linux command line with the Incus Client. And if you watch my video entitled Incus Containers Step by Step, then you probably are SSHing into your Incus server and then performing command line commands to manage it, and you're actually using the Incus Client to accomplish that on your Incus server. So the Incus command line is installed as a part of that Incus server. And if you watch my Lex Console web interface for Incus, that introduces a web-based interface to manage your Incus server. So today we're going to explore the Incus Client for Windows, which supports both a CLI to manage Incus servers and the remote viewer for Incus virtual machines. If you are a Windows user and you have installed Incus on a Linux server, then more than likely your method to managing it is to do a Windows R and go ahead and type in cmd to open a Windows command shell. And then you're doing an SSH over to your Incus server, in my case VMS Rain. And once I get logged in, of course I have a Linux command line, and I can do commands like an Incus list and manage my server from here. One of the major shortcomings of using this method is that if I wanted to connect to one of my virtual machines and display the GUI, I would use the command Incus console win11 -- type equals VGA, and when I hit return, it comes back and says that it cannot open the display. And the reason for that is because Windows does not have an X11 display. Let's go ahead and exit out of this Incus server, and now we're back to the local command prompt on my CMD window. We require privilege in order to install the Incus Client for Windows, so we go down to the Start button and right-click and launch Terminal with Admin Privilege. The User Account Control window comes up and we say yes, and then we should have a PowerShell window. In the PowerShell window, we want to go ahead and execute a winget install Linux containers.incus. And that will go out and go ahead and download the Incus Client for Windows. And as you can see here, it says successfully installed, and it says restart your shell in order to use it. As it turns out, restarting the command shell was not sufficient to recognize the Incus Client. I did not have to reboot Windows, but I did have to log out and log back into Windows. So if we right click here on the Windows button and we go up to Terminal, we will launch a PowerShell window. At this point, I want to do an SSH over to the Incus server that I want to manage remotely, and that's going to be VMS Rain. So once I log into my VMS Rain Incus server, I want to add a trust. And the way I do that is Incus config trust add, and I'm going to go ahead and call my Windows desktop win11-desktop. And what that will do is it will go ahead and print out a certificate token. And now I'm going to go ahead and launch a second terminal shell. And in this Windows PowerShell, I'm going to go ahead and do an Incus remote add VMS Rain, and the address of VMS Rain is 172.16.1.51. And then it asks me if I want to accept the fingerprint. I go ahead and say yes, and then it asks for the trust token. I'm going to come over here and highlight this token. I'll go ahead and do a Control C, and then come back to the other window and right click and hit enter. And that goes ahead and adds the certificate. At this point, I can go ahead and exit out of this VMS Rain server and exit off of here. Now, as a result of having added that certificate over here, and now that we have the trust installed, we're going to be able to perform Incus commands such as Incus remote list, which will say that we have the ability now to manage VMS Rain. In order to be able to manage VMS Rain, I can say Incus remote switch VMS Rain, and now our management context has been switched over to VMS Rain. So at this point, I can go ahead and do an Incus list, and it will list the containers over on VMS Rain. Likewise, I can go ahead and do an Incus launch on Ubuntu, or actually images :Ubuntu /22.04/desktop. We're going to give this one a desktop. You'll see why in just a minute. --VM, and we'll go ahead and name this server test. That will go ahead and launch a test Incus VM over on VMS Rain. Now that our test Incus virtual machine is launched, you'll recall that earlier in the presentation, when I wanted to display a console, it would not work. But now I can go ahead and do an Incus console test --type equals VGA. And before that failed because we didn't have an X11 display, but now we have a locally loaded remote viewer that will launch on this local Windows machine. You can see it coming up with the commands, and there's our remote window, and it's displaying the full GUI of our Incus virtual machine that is running Ubuntu 22.04 with the desktop. Now that we started up our desktop, I'm going to go ahead and exit out of it, and I can just go ahead and hit the X because I wanted to leave the machine up and running. But this time, suppose I wanted to be able to connect to the console of it, but the non-GUI console. So if you've watched my Incus container step-by-step or some of my other videos, you know that we have normally used the command Incus shell test. Unfortunately, here in this client, that particular command does not yet work, and perhaps it will in the future. But we can go ahead and do an Incus exec test and tell it to go into the BOSH shell, and this command is equivalent to the Incus shell test command, and we are in fact logged on to that system. So we can log out of that system, and then we can do an Incus stop test, an Incus delete test. If you have additional Incus servers, of course, you can go and do an SSH over to them. So we're going to do an SSH over to Mondo. And I'll go ahead and accept the fingerprint and go ahead and type my password. And I'm logged into the Mondo machine. So over in Mondo, I'm going to do another Incus config trust add win11-desktop over on that server, and it also gives me a certificate. So I'm going to go ahead and right click, go into another PowerShell, and in this PowerShell I'm going to do an Incus remote, see if we can type correctly, Incus remote add Mondo 172.16.1.225, and I'll accept the fingerprint, and then it asks for the token. So I come up here again, I select the entire token, I do a Control C, I come into the other window and right click and hit enter, and that certificate has been added. At this point, I can exit out of the Mondo server up here and exit out up here. Now recall, if I do an Incus list here, we're going to be getting a list of VMS Rain because that's where our management context is currently set to. And if we do an Incus remote list, it will show us that not only can we manage the VMS Rain server, which is our currently managed server, but we can also manage Mondo. So therefore, I can do an Incus remote switch over to Mondo. And once I do that, if I do an Incus list, you can see that I have 2 Incus virtual machines over there, both of which are stopped. So in summary, the Incus Windows client allows remotely managing Incus servers via the CLI. And the Incus Windows client also includes the remote viewer to display the GUI interface for Incus virtual machines. And Incus containers do not run on Windows. However, the Incus Windows client provides a valuable interface for remote management. And the Incus remote switch command allows switching your management context between different Incus servers. Anyway, that's it for today. Please subscribe and like to the channel, and don't forget to hit that notification bell, and we'll see you next time.